I always thought you were so big and macho. Guess they come in all shapes and sizes. Those were the words that stopped me cold. The one slurred by a drunken Paul as we sat on his back deck. His insinuation was clear, but it didn't make any sense. My wife, Susie, and I had been married for 7 years. We had 2 beautiful boys, a solid home, and a routine that worked. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. He leaned back, took another swig of his beer, and smirked. "You let your wife go out every week with Anne. What the hell do you think they're doing? Talking about work until midnight." I stared at him, the words not quite computing. 2 months earlier, Susie had started going out on Wednesday nights with her coworkers. At first, she came home around 8 o'clock, and I didn't think much of it. But the outings stretched later and later. Lately, midnight had become the new norm. She always had a perfectly reasonable excuse. Dinner ran long, a work problem needed discussing. And she always showered the moment she got home, claiming and cigarette smoke clung to her clothes. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. Paul's drunken grin didn't falter. "Oh, come on, man. Don't tell me you're that clueless. They're hooking up with guys. Big guys. I've seen the marks on Anne. It's not girl talk, my friend." I felt a chill creep down my spine, but I forced myself to laugh. "You're drunk, Paul. You don't know what you're talking about." His expression turned serious for the first time that evening. I wish I didn't. But trust me, I know the routine, and started the same way. Girls' nights. Then it was parties. Then baby showers or weddings that lasted until 3 in the morning. Wait and see. Susie will do the same. The sound of laughter and footsteps coming from the kitchen cut our conversation short. Susie and Ann stepped onto the deck, each carrying a tray of snacks, their voices bright and carefree. Susie's smile was warm, genuine, the kind that had always made me feel lucky to be her husband. But for the first time, doubt lurked beneath the surface. That night, back at home, I watched Susie put the boys to bed, her laughter filling the hallway as she read them their favorite bedtime story. When she finally joined me in bed, I was too preoccupied to respond to her touch. "What's wrong?" she asked, her green eyes full of concern. "Nothing," I lied, but something was wrong, and I couldn't shake it. The following Wednesday, Susie sent me the usual text, going out with an after work. "Don't wait up. Love you." I fed the boys, put them to bed, and sat in the living room, my mind racing. Midnight came and went, and I felt the tension building in my chest. At 12:15, I heard her key in the door. I waited until she stepped into the room before flipping on the light. She jumped, clutching her chest. "Jack, you scared me. What are you doing up?" "Waiting for you," I said, my tone sharp. "How was the Mandingo Club? Did you hook up with one of the black bulls Paul mentioned?" Her face went pale, then red with anger. "What the hell are you talking about? Are you accusing me of cheating?" I crossed my arms. "I know where you've been, Susie. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." For a moment, she faltered, but then her expression changed. A wicked smile crept across her face, one I'd never seen before. "So what?" she said, her voice cold. "There's nothing you can do about it. If I want to sleep with every black man in the city, you'll just have to deal with it. Divorce me, and I'll take everything, the house, the kids, your paycheck. You'll be stuck in a dingy little apartment, eating canned tuna. So just get over it." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer, but it wasn't the anger or sadness I expected to feel. It was something colder, resolve. I watched as she turned and headed upstairs, already pulling off her clothes. "I'm taking a shower," she called over her shoulder. "And you'd better be there when I get to bed. You know I like to spoon." I didn't respond. Instead, I sat in the silence, staring at the spot where she'd been standing. She thought she'd won, that I'd roll over and accept whatever twisted fantasy she was indulging in. But she was wrong. I wasn't going to be the husband who waited and watched as his wife destroyed their marriage. If she thought there was nothing I could do, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. Tomorrow, I began setting my plan in motion. By the time I was finished, Susie wouldn't even recognize the life she thought she controlled. The following morning, Susie acted as if nothing had happened. She hummed softly as she made breakfast for the boys, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, smiling brightly as though the confrontation the night before had never occurred. It was almost infuriating. I couldn't focus at the office that day. Her words echoed in my mind. If I want to sleep with every black man in the city, you'll just have to deal with it. I needed proof. I needed to know how deep this betrayal ran. That evening, as Susie put the boys to bed, I went to her closet. I searched through her clothes until I found what I was looking for. Her Wednesday night outfits. Her dresses and tops smelled faintly of smoke, just as she claimed. But something else caught my attention. One of her dresses had a faint tear along the hem, and on another, the strap seemed stretched unnaturally. It wasn't conclusive, but it added to my suspicions. In the bathroom, I checked the laundry. As usual, her clothes were there, except for her underwear. It wasn't in the hamper. Instead, I found it hanging on the shower rail, freshly washed. Why would she wash her underwear separately? The next Wednesday, I decided to follow her. She sent me her usual text, "Out with Ann. Don't wait up." I kissed the boys goodnight, tucked them into bed, and waited until I saw Susie pull out of the driveway. My heart pounded as I grabbed my keys and followed her car at a safe distance. She didn't head to the usual restaurant she'd mentioned before. Instead, she drove across town to a club I'd never heard of. The bright neon sign read the Silver Palm, and the parking lot was packed. I parked down the street and watched as she got out of the car. She was dressed to impress, a tight red dress that hugged her figure in a way that was undeniably provocative, and was waiting for her near the entrance. And together they disappeared into the club. The place was busy, with music thumping loudly enough to make the walls vibrate. I slipped inside, keeping to the shadows. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of alcohol. It didn't take long to spot Susie and Ann. They weren't sitting at a table. They were on the dance floor. Susie's movements were seductive, her body pressed against a man who towered over her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and clearly comfortable with her attention, and was nearby, similarly entwined with another man. My stomach churned as I watched. This wasn't dinner with co-workers. This wasn't harmless fun. This was betrayal. I waited in the parking lot, hidden in my car, until they emerged from the club hours later. Susie was laughing, her arm draped around the man she'd been dancing with, and was similarly cozy with her partner. They exchanged a few words, then piled into separate cars. Susie didn't come straight home. Instead, she drove to a small motel on the outskirts of town. My heart sank as I watched her disappear inside, her companion following close behind. When Susie finally came home around 4 a.m., I was sitting in the living room waiting. She froze when she saw me, her makeup smudged and her hair disheveled. "Jack," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Why are you still up?" I didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch between us. "Did you have fun tonight?" I finally asked. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It was fine. Just the usual dinner and drinks." I stood, walking toward her slowly. The usual dinner and drinks? At a club? With a man wrapped around you? Followed by a visit to a motel. Her expression shifted, a mix of surprise and defiance. "Were you following me?" "I needed to see for myself," I said coldly. She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "Then you saw exactly what you needed to see. And as I said before, there's nothing you can do about it. This is my life now, Jack. You can either accept it or leave. But if you leave, you'll lose everything." She turned and headed upstairs, leaving me standing in the darkened living room. I didn't sleep that night. her arrogance, her complete disregard for our marriage. It lit a fire inside me. She thought she was untouchable, that she could humiliate me and face no consequences. But she was wrong. I wasn't going to confront her again. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to make her pay. And by the time I was finished, she'd regret every decision that had led her here. The next few days, I pretended everything was normal. Susie's arrogance only grew, and she seemed more emboldened with each passing moment. She'd smirk at me as she got ready for her Wednesday nights, daring me to say something. But I didn't need to say anything. I needed her to believe I was broken, compliant, defeated. By Monday, I had everything in place. The research I'd done in the past few days was enough to make me question the depths of human depravity. There were corners of the internet darker than I'd imagined, where anything or anyone could be bought and sold. Through my work in tech security, I'd spent years tracking cybercriminals. I knew how to navigate the dark web. It didn't take long to find exactly what I needed. The listing was simple. Natural redhead, 26, green eyes, flawless skin. Open to all arrangements. Serious inquiries only. Starting bid, $50,000. Attached was a carefully edited video of Susie, taken from the footage I'd recorded over the past week. Nothing explicit, just enough to show her beauty and charm. Within hours, the bids started rolling in. On Wednesday, as Susie got ready for her weekly outing, I decided to play my part. "You look beautiful," I said as she twirled in front of the mirror, her tight black dress leaving little to the imagination. She smirked. "You're finally learning to appreciate me, Jack. Maybe there's hope for you yet." "Maybe," I replied with a faint smile. As she left, I felt the cold resolve harden in my chest. That night, I finalized the deal. A man named Winston Mugabe had won the bidding at $100,000. He was from the Democratic Republic of Congo and operated in a world where rules didn't apply. We exchanged a series of encrypted messages, and he promised to make the arrangements. "She'll be treated like a queen," he assured me. For a time, I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't care. The next few days passed in a blur. I treated Susie like a queen, showering her with affection and gifts. I wanted her to believe everything was normal, better than normal. "See," she said one night as she curled up next to me on the couch. "This is what I've been waiting for. You're finally getting it." I smiled, but inside, I was counting down the days. By Saturday, everything was ready. Susie was packing for the vacation I'd planned, a trip to the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa. She was thrilled at the idea of lounging on the beach and exploring new opportunities, as she put it. "You're going to love this," she said, kissing me on the cheek. "This is going to change everything for us." She had no idea how right she was. We arrived at the resort on Sunday evening. It was beautiful. A 4-star hotel with white sand beaches and crystal clear water. Susie was glowing, her excitement contagious as she twirled in the lobby, taking in the luxury around her. That night, we dined at the hotel restaurant. I introduced her to Winston, who was already waiting when we arrived. "Susie, this is Winston Mugabe," I said with a smile. "He's a friend of mine." Winston stood, towering over us, his smile charming and disarming. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Susie," he said, taking her hand. "Jack has told me so much about you." Susie blushed, her green eyes sparkling. "It's lovely to meet you, too." Dinner was a blur of conversation and laughter. Winston was charming, and Susie was captivated. By the time we finished, she was hanging on his every word. "Why don't we continue this on my yacht?" Winston suggested as we sipped our after-dinner drinks. Susie's eyes lit up. "I'd love that." She didn't even glance at me as she left the restaurant with Winston, her hand tucked into his arm. That was the last time I saw my wife. Back at the hotel, I packed her things into her suitcases. One of Winston's men arrived to collect them shortly after. He handed me an envelope containing the remaining $100,000, nodded politely, and left without a word. I spent the rest of the week lounging on the beach and exploring the town. It was liberating, knowing that Susie was no longer my problem. When I flew home on our scheduled flight, I told the boys that their mother had decided to stay in Africa for a while. They didn't seem to question it, their young minds unable to grasp the full weight of what had happened. 3 days later and called, frantic and angry. "What did you do to her?" she screamed. "Nothing," I replied calmly. "She met someone and decided to stay. Ask her yourself." I hung up before she could respond. That night, as I sat in my man cave sipping whiskey, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Susie had thought she could destroy me, humiliate me, and walk away unscathed. She was wrong. The $100,000 went straight into a college fund for my boys. Revenge had never tasted so sweet. The week following Susie's departure for the vacation passed in a surreal haze. I pretended life was normal for the boys' sake, but inside, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. She was gone, out of my life, and she couldn't hurt me anymore. But I wasn't done yet. On Wednesday, and called again, her voice laced with suspicion. "She's not answering my calls or texts, Jack. You're lying to me. I know you've done something." "She's with someone new," I replied calmly, living her best life, just like she always wanted. "Isn't that what you encourage her to do?" Anne's silence was brief but telling. "I don't believe you. I'm coming over." "Suit yourself," I said. Hanging up, when she arrived later that evening, she brought backup, a detective who happened to be one of her friends. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his badge clipped to his belt like a prop. "Jack," he said, his tone patronizing. "Anne's concerned about her friend Susie. She seems to think something's happened to her." I crossed my arms, refusing to rise to the bait. "Nothing's happened. She met someone, and she's staying in Africa. She even left her passport stamped as proof." I handed over a copy of the documents Winston had provided. The detective scanned the pages, his expression skeptical but contained. "And you're not the least bit worried about your wife staying behind?" he asked. "Why would I be?" I replied with a shrug. "She made her choice. Maybe you should ask, and why she's so concerned." The detective didn't press further. Instead, he exchanged a glance with Anne, his hand brushing against the small of her back as they turned to leave. Their visit confirmed something I'd suspected for weeks and had been the catalyst for all of this. She was the one who'd introduced Susie to this twisted lifestyle, who'd pushed her further down the path of destruction. She wasn't just complicit. She was the root of the problem. That night, as the boys slept, I poured myself a drink and sat in the man cave, considering my next move. I couldn't let and walk away unscathed. She'd created chaos in my life, and it was only fitting that she experienced the same. The following day, I reached out to Winston. "I have another potential client for you," I said. He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. "You've been busy, Jack. Tell me about her." "She's blonde, about 28, pretty but manipulative. She's the one who started all of this. Think of her as a bonus." He considered my words for a moment before replying. "Send me her details. If she's as valuable as you say, I'll make it worth your while." I spent the next week gathering information, following Anne's movements just as I had Susie's. She was predictable. Wednesday nights at the same club, Saturdays spent at parties, and every interaction with Paul punctuated by her cold disdain. It didn't take long to piece together her routine, and with each step, I felt the pieces of my plan falling into place. I created an email that appeared to be from Susie, inviting Anne to visit her in Africa. The message was carefully worded, dripping with the kind of enthusiasm Anne would expect from her former partner in crime. "And you have to come visit me. My new life here is amazing, luxury, excitement, and everything we ever dreamed of. I've already spoken to Winston, and he's eager to meet you. Leave Paul with the kids, and come have the time of your life. Flights are on me. Love, Susie." It didn't take long for Anne to reply. "Susie, I'm so happy to hear from you. Your life sounds incredible. I'd love to come visit, but money's tight right now. Are you sure about the flights? Let me know. I confirmed the arrangements and forwarded the details to Winston. He was pleased with my efficiency and assured me everything would go smoothly, and left for Africa the following weekend, her departure as unceremonious as Susie's. Paul, clueless as ever, called me a few days later, his voice a mix of confusion and relief. She sent me an email saying she's not coming back, he said. Do you know anything about this? I know she met someone, I replied. She's moving on, Paul. Maybe it's time you do the same. Paul didn't press for details, but I could tell he was grateful. He'd been living in misery for years, and Anne's disappearance was a gift he hadn't expected. As for me, I felt no guilt, and had sown the seeds of chaos in my life, and now she was reaping the harvest. That night, I sat in my man cave, sipping whiskey as I read Winston's latest update, and arrived safely. His message read, "She's adjusting well. I'll wire the additional payment tomorrow." The satisfaction I felt was cold but complete, and had underestimated me, just as Susie had. There was always a price to pay for betrayal, and I'd made sure they both paid in full. Anne's disappearance created a ripple effect, one that began quietly but soon grew into a storm. Paul, relieved to be free from her iron grip, filed for divorce almost immediately. He approached me at the local cafe not long after. "You've no idea how much better my life is now," he said, his voice low but charged with emotion. I raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" She was ruining me, Jack. Controlling everything. Now that she's gone, I finally feel like I can breathe. I took a sip of my coffee, letting his words hang in the air. "I'm glad you're finding peace, Paul." He hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. "I don't know what happened, and I'm not asking. But if you had anything to do with her leaving, thank you." His gratitude caught me off guard, but I gave him a small nod. Sometimes life finds a way of correcting itself. Despite Paul's relief, Anne's absence didn't go unnoticed. Her Wednesday night crowd began whispering, theories spreading like wildfire. Some speculated she'd run off with a wealthy lover. Others hinted at something darker. Anne's sudden silence unnerved them all. A week later, I received another visit from the same detective who had questioned me about Susie. "She's missing too," he said flatly, referring to Anne. "Starting to look like a pattern, don't you think?" I kept my expression neutral. "She's not missing. She left just like Susie. Maybe you should ask why both women decided they were better off somewhere else." He narrowed his eyes, clearly searching for any hint of deception. "Funny how both of their last known interactions seem to involve you." "Coincidence," I said smoothly. "Or maybe I'm just a convenient scapegoat." His silence was long and heavy before he finally turned to leave. "We'll see." Anne's disappearance didn't cause the chaos I'd expected. It dismantled her circle entirely. Without her, the Wednesday night group fell apart. The women grew distant, and their husbands began asserting themselves in ways that had been impossible before. The house of cards I had built was collapsing, and I watched it all from the sidelines with quiet satisfaction. Paul reached out again a few weeks later, this time with a sheepish grin. "Jack, I've been thinking," he said, "about all of this. Anne's gone, and Susie. I don't know. You seem like you've got it all figured out." I raised an eyebrow. "What are you getting at?" He hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Do you ever feel bad about moving on?" "Not once," I replied without hesitation. He nodded, his expression contemplative. "I want that. To stop feeling like I owe something to someone who treated me like nothing." "Then stop," I said simply. "Your life's your own now. Don't waste it looking back." As I drove home that night, I couldn't help but marvel at how far things had come. The weight that had once suffocated me was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that I'd done what needed to be done. But even as I celebrated my small victories, I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over. The detective's suspicions, the whispers among Ann's old friends. Something was brewing, and I wasn't sure how long I could keep everything under control. For now, though, I savored the calm, knowing full well it wouldn't last forever. The weeks that followed were a careful balancing act. I maintained my routines, kept up appearances with the boys, and handled the whispers with quiet indifference. But the detective's visits became more frequent, and his questions more pointed. "You seem awfully calm for a man whose wife left him," he said during one visit, leaning against my doorframe with an air of suspicion. "I accepted reality," I replied, my tone measured. "Sometimes people walk away. It's not my job to chase them." "Funny thing," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "Your name keeps coming up in conversations. First Susie, now Anne. 2 women gone, and both connected to you. Care to explain?" "There's nothing to explain," I said, locking eyes with him. "They made their choices. Maybe you should ask why they were so unhappy." His visits were unsettling but predictable. Each time he left, I felt the tension building, a crack in the calm facade I'd worked so hard to maintain. I knew it was only a matter of time before he pieced together something that didn't add up. Then, one night, the storm finally broke. I was sitting in my man cave, reviewing emails, when I heard the knock at the door. It was late, almost midnight, and my first instinct was to ignore it. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent. When I opened the door, I found the detective standing there, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "Jack Morgan," he said, his voice cold. "We need you to come with us." "For what?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. "Suspicion of involvement in the disappearance of Susie Morgan and in Jones," he replied. The ride to the station was silent, but my mind raced. I had been meticulous, every detail planned, every loose end tied. What had they found? At the station, they placed me in a small, dimly lit room. The detective sat across from me, a folder in hand. He spread out a series of photos on the table. Susie's passport, the email exchange with Anne, and a grainy image of a man who looked vaguely like Winston Mugabe. "You've been busy, Jack," he said, tapping the photos. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You're smart," he said, his voice low. "Too smart for your own good, but smart guys always leave a trail." They had nothing concrete, just circumstantial evidence and theories. I denied everything, maintaining my calm, but the interrogation dragged on for hours. By the time they released me, the sun was rising and exhaustion had settled deep in my bones. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The detective wasn't going to stop, and it was only a matter of time before he found something that couldn't be explained away. But what haunted me most wasn't the risk of getting caught. It was the realization that, despite everything I had done to free myself, I wasn't free at all. That evening, as I sat in the quiet of the house, the weight of my actions pressed down on me. Susie was gone, and was gone. And while I'd rid myself of the chaos they'd brought into my life, I couldn't escape the silence they'd left behind. For the first time, I wondered if I'd crossed a line I could never come back from. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The silence of the house was no longer comforting. It felt oppressive, suffocating. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of the wind outside, seemed to whisper accusations I couldn't escape. I'd gotten everything I thought I wanted, but the emptiness that filled the void was unbearable. The detective's words haunted me. Smart guys always leave a trail. It was a week after my late-night interrogation when everything fell apart. I was in the kitchen making breakfast for the boys when the doorbell rang. This time, it wasn't the detective, it was Paul. His usually timid demeanor was gone, replaced by something harder, darker. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "What's this about?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Anne's gone," he said flatly, "and you're the reason why." "I know it." I froze, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" "She left, Paul. You told me yourself you were happy to see her go." His lips twisted into a bitter smile. I was, until I started asking questions. Until I realized she wouldn't just disappear without a reason. He placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printouts of emails, photos, and even a copy of the dark web listing I'd created for Susie. My stomach dropped as I stared at the evidence. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Paul's expression hardened. "I hired someone, a private investigator. Turns out you're not as careful as you think." I clenched my fists, fighting to keep my composure. "What do you want, Paul?" "I want the truth," he said, leaning forward. "I don't care about the cops, and I don't want revenge. I just want to know what you did to them." I hesitated, the weight of my secrets pressing down on me. But before I could respond, the door burst open, and the detective stormed in with a team of officers. "Jack Morgan, you're under arrest," he said, his voice echoing through the house. The boys screamed as I was handcuffed and led out the door. I tried to keep my head high, but the shame was unbearable. The neighbors gathered on their lawns, watching as I was shoved into the back of a squad car. At the station, the detective didn't hold back. "We've traced your transactions, Jack," he said, slamming a stack of documents onto the table. "The wire transfers, the dark web activity, the emails. You thought you covered your tracks, but you didn't." I said nothing, my silence more damning than any confession. The trial was swift. The prosecution painted me as a cold, calculating monster, and the evidence was overwhelming. The defense tried to argue that I'd been pushed to my breaking point, but it wasn't enough. The judge's words were final and unrelenting. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. As I sat in my cell, the reality of my actions finally sank in. I destroyed Susie, Ann, and myself in the process. The boys were now living with my sister, their lives forever changed by my choices. Revenge had consumed me, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. Months later, I received a letter. It was from Winston. "Your wife has adjusted well to her new life. She's a star in our clubs, adored by the patrons. You were right. She's a remarkable woman." I crumpled the letter and stared out the tiny window of my cell, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I'd wanted freedom, but instead, I trapped myself in a cage of my own making. The silence of the house had been replaced by the silence of prison walls, and the life I'd once known was nothing but a distant memory. Revenge had a price, and I'd paid it in full. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.